The next concept we'll be concentrating on are loops. These are control structures that allow you to execute a block of code multiple times based on certain conditions. They are useful for iterating over arrays, processing repetitive tasks, and automating logic within a program. Loops are used to repeatedly execute the same block of code as long as a condition is met. The basic concept behind a loop is to save time and effort by automating repetitive activities within a program. There are 4 different types of loops supported by PHP. As I just said, loops will repeatedly execute a block of code as long as a condition is true. The loop will continue running until the condition evaluates to false. The basic premise of how loops works is as follows. When you're working with for loops, you'll run an initialization. This is where you set up a variable or a counter, and this is usually initialized before the loop starts. All loops are going to have a condition check. So before each iteration, PHP is going to check to see if the condition is true. If true, the loop body will execute, and if false, the loop will stop. All loops will execute the code, so whatever the code is inside the loop will run if the condition is met. And then when we use for and while loops, we will increment and update. So the counter variable is updated after each iteration. This will prevent the loop from infinitely running if the condition never becomes false. You can think of loops in PHP as control structures that allow you to execute a block of code multiple times based on a specific condition. We use these often when we want to iterate over arrays, process repetitive tasks, and automate logic within a program. There are 4 types of loops in PHP. The for loop is used when the number of iterations is known. The while loop is used when the number of iterations is unknown and based on a condition. The do while loop is similar to while, but it will always run at least one time. And the for each loop is specifically used to iterate over arrays. Let's start off by looking at the for loop. As I mentioned, this loop is used when the number of iterations is known. This is an example of a for loop. The first part of the loop is where we do an initialization. We do this by specifying the variable I set to 1. This is going to set up the loop by initializing the variable I with a starting value of 1. In this case, we'll refer to the variable I as the loop counter. The second part is the condition. This is I is less than or equal to 3. Before each iteration, PHP will check to see if I is less than or equal to 3. If it's true, the loop is going to execute. If it's false, the loop will stop. The third part is the code execution. This is where we will echo out iteration and then print whatever the number is. Printing the current value of I with a line break is what's going to happen. Once the loop runs through this once, it's going to hit the I++. That is simply going to increase the value of I by 1 after each iteration. Let's jump into our code so we can look at how a for loop actually functions. We'll start off by identifying the loop with for. We're going to open our parentheses and we'll pass in the conditions that we want to use with our loop. So I'm going to use $I, and we'll go ahead and set this to 0. Then I'm going to use a semicolon. The next value that we're going to establish is going to be I, and this time let's use less than 5. This is going to specify how long we want the loop to continue. So as long as this condition is true, the loop will run. The next thing is we're going to go ahead and increment I. We do that by writing I++. This is simply going to increment I after each iteration. We'll open up our curly braces, and within the curly braces, we'll set up what we want to happen. So in this example, I'm simply going to print to my screen the number of the iteration. So we'll write iteration colon. We're going to go ahead and call in our variable of I, and then we'll go ahead and put a BR element so that each iteration will print on its own line. Let's save this and check it out in the browser. And as you can see, it's going to print the iteration. And as soon as this condition right here is no longer true, the loop stops and it exits the loop. Now let's take a look at the while loop. This is used when the number of iterations is unknown and it depends on a condition. How this works is we are going to initialize our variable. We're setting I to 1. Before the loop starts, I is going to be initialized to 1. This variable serves as the loop counter. Then we'll go ahead and set our condition. The condition is inside of the parentheses, and before each iteration, PHP is going to check to see if I is less than or equal to 5. If it's true, the loop is going to execute. If it's false, the loop will stop. Then we're going to have our code execution. In this case, we're going to print to the page number, and then we'll specify whatever the value of I is. We'll also include a line break. Then we have our I++, and this just increases I by 1 after each iteration. This is a very important part of the while loop because it will prevent an infinite loop. If the I++ were missing, then I would never change and the loop would run forever. Let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. The first thing we'll do is we'll establish the value of I. We're going to begin by setting this to 0. Then we're going to go ahead and type while, and then we'll specify our condition. So in the parentheses, we are going to say if I is less than 5, and then I'm going to open up my curly braces, and inside the curly braces, we're going to go ahead and specify what it is that we want to happen. So in this case, we'll use echo. We'll write the number is. We'll go ahead and request our variable to be displayed. And then once again, we're going to include a break so that each value appears on its own line. Finally, I need to increment I or change the value of it every time the loop goes through. So we'll use I++. I'll save this and let's look in the browser. If we refresh our page, you can see here's our while loop, and it says the number is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. As long as it's less than 5, it will continue to run. The do while loop is similar to while, but always runs at least once, even if the condition is false. How this works is it will execute the block of code at least one time. Even if I is greater than 5, the code will still run. After the execution, it will check the condition, and in this case, that is I less than or equal to 5. If it's true, it loops again, otherwise it stops. Let's set up a simple do while loop. Once again, I'm going to set the value of I, so we'll use $I. We're going to go ahead and set this equal to 0. Then we'll type do. We're going to open our curly braces, and we're going to go ahead and echo out whatever we want to have happen. So in this case, we'll say do while iteration. We'll go ahead and print the value of I, and then once again, we'll include a break element. We need to set up our counter, so we'll go ahead and increment I by using I++. And then when you're making a do while loop, after the closing curly brace, you're going to type while, and then in parentheses, you're going to go ahead and set the condition. So we will go ahead and specify that I is less than 5. Let's save our code and look at it in the browser. And here we get the results of our do while loop. The last loop that we're going to be talking about is the Foreach loop. This type of loop is specifically used to iterate over arrays. If you've been following along with me, then you are familiar with the Foreach loop because I showed you this when we talked about arrays, but I'll just go through it once again. What we're doing here is we're going ahead and setting up a fruit array. In this case, it contains apple, kiwi, and cherry. Then we're going to specify for each. This is going to look at the fruits array, and we're going to set up a new variable called fruit. This is going to allow us to loop through each item in the array. On each iteration, the current array element is going to be stored inside of our fruit variable. The value of fruit will be printed using the echo statement. We use the for each loop when we're looping through arrays and when we're dealing with associative arrays. Let's take a look at the for each loop in practice. Here I'll set up a new array. I'm going to assign the values for my array using the square braces, and I will be using strings, so I'm going to use quotes. Then we'll go ahead and we'll set up our for each. In parentheses, I'll use $animals. We'll say as animal so that we have a container to store the value every time we iterate through the array. After the parentheses, I'll open my curly braces and we're going to state what it is that we want to happen. We'll write animal called, we'll print the name of the animal, and then we'll use a break so that each animal will appear on its own line. I'll save this and let's take a look in the browser. When I refresh my page, you can see that we have an animal called octopus, turtle, whale, and shark. If we compare the for loop types, you can see that the for loop is used when you know how many times you want the loop to occur. The condition is checked before the loop runs, and this is best used for counting, ranges, or index-based loops. An example would be looping from 1 to 10. The while loop type is going to be used when the loop should run until a condition is false. The condition is checked before the loop runs. This is best for user input and waiting for a specific condition. An example would be to wait for a user to enter a valid number. The do while loop is going to be used when the loop must execute at least once. The condition is checked after the loop runs, which is why it will run at least one time. This is best for menus and user prompts. An example would be if we ask a user for input at least one time. The for each loop is used when looping through an array. The condition is not really applicable in this case, and it is best for arrays and objects. An example would be printing all items in an array. So you should use for when you know the number of times to loop. You should use while when looping until a condition is met. You should use do while when the code must run at least one time. And of course, you should use for each for arrays and objects. I hope this provides a better understanding of what the for loops are and when you would want to use them within your code.